Like real life stuff now. Most people say the problem is that it's an IE window. I told you, I think most Phonegap developers spend 80% of their time in the browser building a web app. So it's not unusual to see dialogues like that. I think that what's wrong in this dialogue is the line number. Unless you already optimized everything and you end up with one JavaScript file. But I see that all the time, and I think we are on a path to there if we don't do something about the code right now. Line 3377, that can't be, right? So you have to, partition, organize your code. Of course, that can happen after optimization of the code, where everything is concatenated into one file. But if you have something like that in development, that's bad. And we are on that track right now. So it's time to implement that principle number 3, which is about providing structure to your application. Now, there are different, kind of methodologies or patterns that people use, typically MV something, MVC or MVVM. I don't really, care, whatever you like. The VM has to do with the view model that I talked about before. Some people like that. Some people say, hey, we don't need to over-engineer and end up, with 5 layers just to render a view. So that's totally up to you, but you need to do something about it. So, for instance, you may have objects that are responsible for, accessing your data, or anything that's related to data manipulation, and that could be something like that. So, for instance, this is inspired by Backbone, but it's just a typical example where you would have a product object. So this is essentially a constructor where you simply provide the REST endpoint. And based on that, this object would be capable of retrieving products, updating products, creating new products, simply by making the calls to the REST services. And then you would have objects that are responsible for displaying a product and nothing else. That's really the point. So that would be something like, in our case, a product view that you would instantiate, and it would have some lifecycle methods, like, for instance, render, where you would have the logic to actually render the view, like, for instance, merge the model into the template to actually display the view. So very specific responsibility for that object. And then you would have, for instance, a controller type of class. So now we go back to that mysterious product adapter that we looked at before. And you see that, oh, this specific version, that's a JSON adapter, is actually making AJAX calls. All right? And we'll revisit that because that's actually quite important to have a specific API that we're going to talk about later, but that would be a controller class, and that's kind of an MVC type of pattern here. So let's take a quick look at the application in part 5, and in fact we skipped 4, so we'll revisit 4 in a sec. In part 5, if you look at the JS folder, you will see that I have a lot of classes now compared to that single app.js before. So I have home view. And so we moved a lot of things in there. So we get the template. Then we initialize the view. So what we do here, we actually create a wrapper for the view, which is a div. The reason we do that is that we can attach all the event listeners to that wrapper. Okay, so that when the view goes away, so I remove the view from the DOM, all these event listeners go away too, and you don't end up with ghost event listeners, which happens a lot when you do that kind of, injecting and removing views. You remove the view, but all the event listeners stick around. That's often a problem when you build single-page applications. So in this case, we create a wrapper, a div, and we attach all the events that are specific to the view to that div. And so that would solve the problem. Yep.
So you're basically gonna route everything to that one, right?
Say that again.
So you're basically gonna route everything to that one. Well, you're gonna catch a particular set of events through that, right? To avoid having memory issues.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. In that specific view. Now remember, there is going to be one instance of that view.
Yeah. No, I think like obviously, I mean, there's no other solution for this, but so it's like,
yeah.
But yeah, I get it. Jesus Christ, let me see that.
What's that?
Let me see this as well. Sorry, I'm just like, because like alarm bells are going up in my head when I see some of this, and I need to put bugs on the platform so we can fix this.
Okay.
So yeah, you guys should be telling like people like me this crap because this is really bad.
Yeah.
It's like, really? This is how you're getting around the problem? I'm not criticizing. I think there's no other way of doing it. But yeah.
It's not that bad. Sorry, but I mean, what's wrong with event delegation?
Well, you're creating a div to do event delegation. Why don't you just create an event delegator?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
It usually depends. In this type of architecture, you also have application-wide delegators.
Yes,
It's when you share between models. It's encapsulated, right?
Yes. This is really, these are not all the application events. These are really the application specific to one instance of that view. But yeah, I mean, as I said, there are many ways to, to solve the same problem.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's totally fine. All right, and so then in here, as I said, you use the template to actually render the view. And that is one example. So here's the product view. So we kind of do the same thing here. We initialize, we have some event handling there, and then render. So now let's take a look at how the application works. You see that app.js is getting smaller and smaller, which is good. So we just have the route function left here. And like, for instance, when we are asking for the details of a product, what we do is that we instantiate a product view object, passing the product as an argument to the constructor here. Okay, so this becomes a lot cleaner. We don't have all these render this, render that function in the in that one app.js. We actually instantiate a product view and we pass the model to it. All right, so one thing that I skipped was the template loading. Remember how we did it in part 3? So that was this. This was a quite questionable approach to doing it. So, having all these script tags in index.html and having all these, HTML blocks in there. So if you look at part 4, template loader, I told you I have a little small example of a template loader, and that goes back to the point that you were making before. Can we XHR all these views in? And that's kind of what we are doing here. So this is just a little utility with a load method. And basically what we do, we will asynchronously load using an AJAX GET here, but essentially an XML HTTP request. We're going to load a bunch of .html files that are passed to us as an argument. So basically, let me show you first how the thing is getting called. So at some point in the application, we will load the templates. And you can load as many as you want, okay, depending on what your application needs. In this case, I need home, I need product, and I need product list item. Now, what are these things? They are plain HTML files that I keep, in this case, in a TPL template folder. Okay, so here is one. So that's pure HTML. Here is product, HTML with placeholder, product list item. Okay, so the template loader will grab all the arguments that were passed to the load function and do a get, so basically asynchronously load each template. We use deferred object to kind of handle the asynchronous nature of these requests nicely, and then we are done, and we keep track of all the templates in a template object here, which means that then in the views, which is what I'm doing here, we can simply ask for a specific template that has already been loaded to that template loader object. Again, this is one approach. You know, I'm going to speak about another approach using required.js in a few minutes. A nice little template loader utility that you can fine-tune to fit your specific needs. Does that seem to satisfy what you wanted to do with XHR? Yeah, cool.
I was just going to ask, is this somehow similar to the strategy that Backbone Layout Manager uses, right? From fetching the templates?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, they are not 200 different ways of doing it. Either it's inlined in script blocks, or you have to asynchronously load them. And then it's just a matter of... Yep.
I do more web development and not mobile development.
Yep.
But at least on my last project, almost 80% or more of the decisions I had to make, they are in the same pace of these.
Yeah.
But the only major difference is that I tend to use Rails and Ruby, and I have the ASCII pattern. So I do all the pre-processing of the template, of the handlebars templates there. But in this case, I need something else
to do it.
Because I use CoffeeScript, I use SAS, so I pre-process everything together. In this case, we need to do it with probably a little bit different strategy.
Yeah.
That's why I'm just trying to understand.
Right. This is similar to the Backbone layout utility. Remember, I mean, don't take this as like the gospel. These are examples of a decent implementation. Depending on your project, you may have to tweak it a little bit, but this is certainly a good start. All right. So, yes. So the other thing that I wanted to show you in part 5, since that's where we are, is that so far I tricked you guys. See that product adapter? Let's really take a look at what it is. Okay, there is the implementation. We didn't look at it, but in fact, it's a memory adapter, right? Everything is in memory. It's a big static array, but it has that nice API, find by ID, find by name, which is what we want. Now, that's often how I start, by the way, and that's a matter of preference. But before investing the time in building the services or asking someone to build the services for me, it's good to kind of know what data you really need. And starting with a kind of a mock adapter is actually a great idea. Because that's very fast to build, right? It's just an array. You play around. Oh, should I organize the data this way, that way? The other reason you always kind of want this, a kind of an in-memory or a mock adapter, is what? Testing. Testing. Who said testing? He said testing. OK, I heard testing that way too. Don't worry, if more of those. Who said testing? You said testing? OK, great. You don't want to you couldn't unit test with a server dependency, so it's a really good idea, and we'll speak more about that in a second, to have pluggable adapters. And for your unit tests, you obviously use the, the in-memory adapter so that you can really have a very granular type of test. Now, since we are on this thing, we'll come back to that in a second, but do you notice something strange here in that API, find by ID, find by name? For these adapters to be pluggable, if I want to be able, to be able to say, hey, now I'm using the in-memory adapter and then easily replace it with a JSON adapter. What's the condition, what's the requirement to make that possible, to really easily kind of remove one and plug the other one in? Common interface, so I need obviously functions with the same name, but also the same invocation, the same signature, which means the same way to invoke them, right? And in this case specifically, that means that I need to make all my adapters asynchronous to make it simple, because otherwise, obviously the in-memory adapter, there is no reason. I mean, I can get values from an array synchronously, obviously, but I still do it asynchronously, because when I will use the JSON adapter, it's going to be asynchronous, and it should, all right? So to be able to replace it with the in-memory adapter has to be asynchronous too, so that the other components that use the adapters, they don't care which one you use. They always invoke these methods the same way. Make sense? Okay? So in this case, we use the promise pattern to actually handle, or in this case, kind of simulate an asynchronous call. So I'm using the jQuery implementation of the promise pattern here. I'm creating a deferred. Let me show it to you here. I'm creating a deferred object. Then I'm looping through my array. Now, the return value, I return promise. I return the promise, but as you can see, I resolve it right away with the value that I found, but that's still going to enable me to make an asynchronous call to get the specific product. We'll look at some code, some other code in a second, but since we were looking at that, I wanted to show it to you. So simply remember, for these adapters to be really pluggable, they need to have the same signature, which for data adapters means typically that they need to all be asynchronous, even when they don't really need to be asynchronous. All right. And that brings us to the next section. Still very much related to the previous one. The previous one was about to have some organization in the application. One of the things that you want to achieve is to avoid polluting the global namespace, right? So that's a typical thing you can do, and that's kind of a very easy way of doing it. Typically, you'd have like a single global variable app or whatever you call it, and then everything is in there, or at least what you would typically want to declare as globals would be in there, the basic parameters and functions of your application. But then people also like to implement a more formal module pattern. That's kind of an implementation of the JavaScript module pattern. There are two things that are interesting about this function. What's interesting about this function? It's what? Self-invoked function. Yeah, so it's invoked immediately or self-invoked. So you declare it and you see that it's invoked right away, and it's also anonymous, right? So it's an immediate function. And the nice thing about this is that obviously it creates a kind of an entity, essentially a module, where nothing that's in there is going to be available to other objects, which essentially kind of defines an encapsulated module. So a lot of times, people coming from other languages like Java or C# or C++, people will ask, okay, we are a big team of developers. We need to create modules. I need to, create encapsulated stuff. How do I declare, private or protected variables when they come from all these different languages? That's essentially, the way to do it. Where, this is basically your internal, implementation. This is what you expose to the calling objects. The calling object using this module will never be able to access, these variables. Okay, so that's the standard module pattern in JavaScript. Now, there are different ways to implement that. So you can implement it yourself, a pretty easy pattern. But there are other problems that you may want to solve. Like, it's one thing to create all these modules, and then at some point, this is going to happen, right? And that happens all the time. And that happens to us already. And we have an application with 2 views. And we already have like 5, 6, 7 different, script tags. And then you are one new developer on that team, and you created your little, module like I showed you before. And you look at this, and maybe your module depends on something. Maybe it uses handlebar, so that handlebar has to be has to come after this one, but should it come before this? At some point you look at this, and where am I supposed to put mine, right? Because there are dependencies there that after a while you don't understand anymore, because you don't know what references what at what level in that list, okay? And that is a major issue when you start dealing with these applications. And then related to that is, at some point, reaching to your dependencies becomes quite cumbersome. And when you start doing ... typically it's a bad sign, because you kind of reach very deep into other objects, and that's often the sign that you need to manage your dependencies in a different way. Well, required.js is essentially solving these 2 problems. It lets you get rid of this problem. So you're going to have a single script tag. And now, before I go any farther, I should mention that there is now a module specification. And I don't know if you know the exact status.
Yes.
OK, all right. So this is, we hope to see a module, a standardized way. So this required.js is essentially an open source community project that works right now. Hopefully, it's not going to be needed in the future when the module specification is going to be available or implemented. But at this point, that's how you do it. So required.js lets you really, gives you a solution to this. You don't need to define all these scripts. Every time you write a module, you basically declare the modules you depend on. So you declare your dependencies. Required.js is going to be smart enough to say, OK, that one is loaded. I'm all set. Ooh, that one is not loaded yet. So I'm going to go ahead and load this module. OK, so it's going to go through all your dependencies, check which one is loaded and which one is not, and make sure that before you start executing your module, all your dependencies have been loaded. OK? So that's essentially what required.js is going to do for you. So let's take a quick look at part 6 and 7. So in part 6, you will see that everything is now implemented as a module. So if you look at homeview.js, productview.js, in that version of the application, they all implement the module pattern. Okay, now the way you want to do your own namespacing here is totally up to you. There are also patterns to automatically create the different levels of nesting of your namespace. So you can take a look at that too. This is one example of an implementation, but the key thing is that every single component, every view is implemented as its own module. So this one doesn't give you a really good example of the benefits. So let me take a look at, the product adapter one. So again, so here, I mean, this example is a slightly more interesting. So you see that by using the module pattern, everything that I have in here is totally private to my module. Okay, nobody is ever going to be able to reach this variable inside my module directly. At the end, I say, okay, this is what I return. This is my public API. Okay. And these are the only two things at this point that my module exposes. So when I create an object of that type, you can only invoke two things on that object, find by ID and find by name. Okay? So let's take a quick look at the required JS implementation. This one is going to be pretty interesting. All right, so this is app.js, and you see that now it's getting really, really small. The first part is actually the one that takes all the time here, is simply configuring essentially your path to the different libraries and modules. So you say, hey, and this is totally up to you the way you set it up. My base URL is going to be lib. In other words, if I don't specify anything else, I say require jQuery, I expect to find jQuery here. And indeed, it's there. Okay? Now, you can define your base URL differently if you want. So based on the base URL, every time I prefix something with app, go find it in .js, based on lib. So I go up one level and then down into JS, okay? And TPL for my templates, /TPL, okay? So for instance, you can see that right there already, I declare a dependency. I say, okay, I need a router because I need to, start the router. And this is how you say I need a router as opposed to putting a script in there, router.js, okay? So here is another example. In the router itself, I'm assuming I'll have a bunch of dependencies in here too. Look at that. So the router needs jQuery. It needs a product adapter. It needs the home view, and it needs the product view, okay? And so by doing that here, it will be loaded, and it will be available in whatever the variable you declare here. So what can I do with product adapter, with that variable now, based on what I just showed you 2 minutes ago? Remember the return value of product adapter? Find by name and find by ID. So with this object, I can call these two methods, okay? Which I do here, actually. Okay. Does that make sense? Now, here is, I think, the interesting one. Which version of the adapter am I loading here? Look at this. This is really similar to a concept that I'm sure you have been using maybe with other languages, called dependency injection. Right? I'm going to say, hey, I need a product adapter. Now, which one am I loading here? It depends which one I configured. So look, I'm requiring adapter/product. Now let's go look at my configuration here. And here I do a mapping. And I say, when I'm asked adapter/product, give that one. Okay, and that, because this is actually a mapping. This is a virtual name. Okay, there is nothing in my directory structure that maps this. This is a mapping. Okay, so I say, whenever someone requires adapters/product, give that one. And that one I can actually find in my directory structure. It's in apps. It's in app. Adapters app is mapped to JS, as we know. Adapters and product memory. OK, I can find product memory.js. So now, if in one quick change, I wanted to say, enough with that memory adapter. I'm ready to, the server guy finally built all the RESTful services. I'm ready to test that. What's the impact of that? Where do I have to go change my application to, throughout the entire application, use RESTful services instead of, mock data? Right here. And what do I do? JSON-P. You see that guy here? JSON-P. OK. So I'm going to do this. And I'm done. Every single time, like you saw here in router, someone is going to ask for adapters/product. Now I'm going to give that guy my JSON-P adapter. OK? So super easy to test, super easy to switch from one data access strategy to another one. And your code is super stable. I can change my data access strategy. I don't have to go muck around in all the other objects to change the data access strategy. Now let's look at product JSON-P, because this one we haven't looked at. And it's actually a lot simpler than the memory adapter. You see, it still has find by ID and find by name. And the only thing it does is to actually make an AJAX call. Now, remember what the memory adapter returned? What was the return value of find by ID and find by name? A promise. And what's the return value of find by ID here? It's a promise. And why is it a promise? Because that's the return value in jQuery of an AJAX call as of 2 point something. They return promises. OK? So this automatically is going to return a promise. This is going to return a promise. I have a consistent API. And that promise is going to be resolved automatically by the internal implementation of the AJAX call. Okay? So these two adapters have the exact same API. With required JS, I can really do something like dependency injection, simply change the reference here, and the right version of the adapter is going to be injected in all the other components when they require adapters/product. Okay? So you can do these funny mappings, and they are really, really convenient. So that's a virtual name. It's not, that is not a module. It's a virtual name that you then map to a specific module, and you have one central place to kind of change that mapping. OK? Do you guys see the? How many people use required JS today? A couple of you. OK, cool.
How does it resolve the, for example, jQuery needs to load it async, I assume?
Yes.
So it's reads the code and figures out what the requires are from the code, or because I didn't see it load asynchronously. So
yeah. So this is actually it's a good question. This is actually the syntax syntax sugar, but you make a good point, because when you're looking at this syntax, it doesn't look like an asynchronous call, right? It's like, OK, well, that looks very much to me like a synchronous call. So when the file is loaded, require is going to parse it and going to make these calls asynchronously. This is a shortened syntax. If you look at the required.js documentation, the default syntax is a more traditional asynchronous call where it come out with a callback. But a lot of people find that very cumbersome to write that code. So that's why they came up with that syntax, which is really the common JS type of syntax. But it requires some upfront parsing of the file to actually make it right. But that's a good point. These calls, even though they don't look asynchronous, are asynchronous. All right? Now, should you use required.js? I'm not saying you should all the time. I find that for non-trivial applications, it really helps. The other thing that I needed to show you, remember all that mess with templates? You really didn't want them in a script block. You kind of liked my little template loader, but we're not too impressed. OK, so required.js can load, not only does it load scripts, it can also load plain text. And if you think about it, what is a template? It's plain text. So let's take a look at product view, for instance. Look, so yeah, you have a few standard require. OK, so you say that product view requires jQuery and handlebar. And then you say that it requires product.html, okay, with text exclamation mark, which is essentially the text plugin for required.js. And so now this is really going to be the pure HTML value that is actually available in product.html. So now you can forget my template loader and use this instead. So this loads essentially templates on demand. OK? Cool. All right, so let's continue. So we covered that. All right, so now we're going to talk about frameworks. This is always a very difficult topic because usually I have a few supporters of different frameworks in the room. And I think the number one question that at least beginners ask us when we go to a Phonegap presentation somewhere is, OK, well, cut through all the talk and tell us which framework to use. And the reality is, there is no answer to that. But so I'm not going to tell you what framework I think or we think is the best framework, but I want to let you know how I and sometimes we think about it and different ways to look at frameworks. I think what's helpful is really to look at two categories of framework and to look at them that way, to understand where they fall when you classify them that way. I think they are what I'd call full stack frameworks, and then another approach is to kind of build your own stack. By full stack, I mean they do everything. They will help you with DOM manipulation, query the DOM. They will help you with architecture, so they will provide some kind of MVC infrastructure. And then they will try to make your application look good. They will provide you with some themes and UI components that look a certain way. Okay? A very easy to understand example of that would be jQuery Mobile or Sencha. Okay, they do everything. It's one-stop shopping. Benefit, it works, or at least it's supposed to work. You don't really have to worry about the integration of these layers because they do it for you. Downside, they tend to be big, opinionated, and not very flexible. In other words, if I like, which is something that we saw a lot initially with Phonegap, I like the jQuery Mobile UI, let's say. All right, I'm going to embrace that thing just for the UI, and then I'm going to have to live with this that I really don't like, but I have to live with it and fight against it, because that's really not my way of doing things. But I have no choice, because the framework doesn't lend itself to, kind of say, oh, you just want the UI, here it is. You don't have to use the other layers. So when you embrace jQuery Mobile, you really kind of embrace the full stack. Even more with Sencha, because it's bigger and probably more opinionated. Okay? Now, if you like their UI and you like their architecture, then, maybe that's a good solution for you. But at least you need to understand that. It's okay to use jQuery Mobile, but you need to make sure that you use it for the right reasons. And if you're in the situation that I just described, I kind of have to use it because it's the only solution to get decent UI components. Maybe that was true, 2 years ago. It's certainly not true today. There are many other ways to get good UI components. So please don't use jQuery Mobile for that reason. Okay? So the other approach is to kind of pick and choose, and maybe sometimes build your own somewhere. So you may say, OK, for DOM manipulation, you know what? I'm going to use jQuery or Zepto because I think jQuery is too big. It's your opinion, whatever. In the recent version of jQuery, you can also pick and choose the modules that you want. I think this is the big one today, where there is a lot of debate out there, which one is the best between Backbone, Angular, Ember. I think these are really the three that a lot of people talk about these days. Knockout, I notice people coming from the Microsoft world like Knockout. In the same way, people coming from the Rails community like Ember, for obvious reason. They are all good options. Let me just give you some high-level guidelines. If you don't like to be bossed around, is that correct English, Brian? If you don't like to deal with opinionated people that tell you what to do, then you will probably like Backbone, because Backbone is really not opinion. I think it's the least opinionated framework out there. You use the pieces that you like. It doesn't really tell. It's just some architectural guidelines, but it's really not opinionated at all. Angular and Ember are a little more opinionated. Now, for some people, that's good because they like to be on tracks, and people tell you, hey, to build a view, you do A, B, C, and you're done. Okay, so they are not opinionated like these guys. They are just a little more structured, which for some people is good. So if you place these frameworks on a spectrum from very loose kind of pick and choose some basic architecture to the ABC way of building an application, Backbone would be on this side, Angular and Ember would be somewhere in the middle, and these guys would be in the very inflexible, opinionated way. So I'm saying that without any judgment. I guess it depends on the application that you're building, what you like, things like that. So that's for that. And then that's kind of what I'm really excited about these days. It's the UI layer, because now you have a few options here to really choose a UI layer that's completely decoupled from the rest. And that's very refreshing, because in the past, that was basically your only option if you were a lousy designer like I am. Okay, so Topcoat, I guess that's the old logo. Bootstrap, Zerp Foundation, Ratchet is a kind of a prototyping thing that is not maintained anymore, I think, and that's very iOS specific, and worse, iOS 6 specific. So you can probably forget that one for now. what I really like about Topcoat is that it was kind of mobile first and performance first. So take a look at that, and I think you would be interested. Yeah.
Regarding when you were talking about the backbone itself, do you usually tend to need something else besides backbone? Because from my experience, what I've learned is that I learned during the process of using backbone. Because I do one thing and I will redo it in a different way, a better way.
Yep.
But I'm only able to understand how will I be creating the relational models after I pass by the fact of having to build those relations on my models and collections. But I also tend to feel that I need to bring something else, like the view bindings that are not there by default.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of new, they are not that new, I think. So some frameworks growing on top of backbone. Thorax, Marionettes, some of those. Do you usually use something else on top of backbone, or just create your own patterns and experience and go on with that?
Yeah. I mean, I do. I like Backbone a lot personally. I think that then there is a kind of a plugin ecosystem on top of Backbone. If you embrace these plugins, and some of them are really useful, you need to be aware of what you're giving away. You're moving on that spectrum a little bit to this side. If you like Backbone because it was very not opinionated at all, usually these plugins tend to add opinions on top of Backbone, which can be totally fine, because then you can pick, you say, hey, that's the way I like to do bindings. I'm going to add that plugin on top. As long as you're aware of what you're giving away, then I think it's totally fine. Some of these plugins are really useful. The smaller the better, is my, if the plugin is 10 times as big as the framework that you kind of install it on top of, because then you're back to embracing a stack that would be difficult to undo if you had to.
Because in a bigger team, probably a lot of people look at the same problem. If they don't know how can they go on with it, probably they can go with different ways, and it can mess a little bit the code base.
Yeah.
It's kind of always the tension, right? Like you're going to be balancing these things. In early Phonegap, this was just not even possible. Early Phonegap, the jQuery took 3 seconds to initialize. And people blame Phonegap, but it wasn't Phonegap, because jQuery was pretty big at the time. It wasn't designed for mobile, really. And then things like Zepto emerged, and people were building really light apps. But another thing to keep in mind when you're building these apps, like, this is not a lot of screen real estate. So the app probably can't do a lot anyhow. Probably shouldn't do a lot. Like if your app requires every Phonegap plugin and a huge framework and MVC architecture, that's a hell of a mobile app. Like, it must be doing a lot of stuff, and that might not be a good pattern for the app itself. It could be a sign that your app is getting too big. Maybe you should build more apps instead of one big super app. It's every byte counts in mobile, and like the other problem is, we're all testing on rad devices like these things, but our users are probably not really shitty phones. So that's fun.
So you obviously see more performance, more better performance in small frameworks now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, less is more.
Yeah.
Like I wouldn't. It always comes down to the build or buy, and you start off when you're getting this new project going. You iterate all these features that you think you're going to have eventually, and you start looking at frameworks that fulfill those features. I would recommend just trying out JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, and do what Christophe's showing you. Iterate towards something that's clean, keeping performance in mind the whole time, and testability. And you may be surprised, like, how good you can build an app with your own source code.
I think it's visible comparing Topcoat to Twitter Bootstrap, for example. The philosophy it's that because Bootstrap is huge. A lot of things, if I use Bootstrap in a mobile application, I will send them away because I won't use them.
Yeah, it's funny because people will be like, oh, well, how does your feature list compare? It's like, well, we're not solving the same problems. We're not trying to be, tick for tack for performance features. Like we're just trying to actually, build apps really fast, apps, ideally.
Yeah.
I have a question about cross-device and what comes into play if you want to make an app on iOS and Android. It's one, of course, you can change the colors and fonts, but it's probably more than that. Layout. Do you use anything for that, or is it just manual, like write your own CSS?
Top code, and I think all of these frameworks are fairly battle tested on the major phones, so you're pretty safe there. The big thing you'll always have to consider is iOS doesn't have a back button. So you're going to need to render one on iOS. And if you render a back button on Android, then your Android users are going to think you suck. So don't do it on Android. And it's funny because that's why we introduced that merges folder. And the merges folder got rid of the pattern where we'd see people doing if iOS, load this thing, else Android. Top code will just work wherever. And then I think a little bit of conditional code is safe now that we're down to a 3-horse race. But ideally, there's no conditional code at all. And you use that merges folder.
You see that you can solve most of it with CSS, just moving things around, colors.
Yeah.
Of course.
The best apps don't even use any native UI patterns, right?
Yeah.
The really great apps, like if you look at what are those guys called, Tapbots? They completely customize their UIs, and even though they're very iOS specific, all those Tapbot apps would look great on Android too, because they're branded to them instead of the operating system. So in a way, I think like if you get creative with your user experience, if you're lucky enough to have a good UX team, then you can take these things really far and have a consistent UI experience across all the platforms.
I think Google is also doing a good job with Maps and the Google Plus app, which
they're building better iOS apps than Apple. Yeah, it's crazy.
You don't have to think that it's not iOS; it's maybe better iOS.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. I think, like a year or 2 years ago, there was a trend that people wanted to mimic the native behavior or the native look and feel pixel by pixel. And you had all these crazy little CSS frameworks. Hey, I solved it. Look, my UI looks exactly, and they had magnifiers pixel by pixel comparing the native UI and the CSS implementation. But look what happened. When was it? 3 weeks ago? Major, and then oops, now we have to kind of always, and that's on iOS, which has been very stable. But imagine on Android. I mean, what is the native Android UI anyway, right? And I think the trend has really changed. Like 2 years ago, everybody said, oh, it has to look native. But now on iOS, you don't even know what the native UI is. So, don't try to mimic. And if you look at Facebook, Twitter, and all that, now it's their brand as opposed to the OS brand. And I think that's really the new trend. You have a brand, use that brand for your UI, as opposed to trying to mimic, Apple's brand or Google's brand. I think that's really the new trend.
I remember Apple was very strict about their design guide, and if it doesn't match, the app gets rejected.
Yeah. It's not like that anymore, because even if you look at their apps, they look fairly different.
Apple's guidelines are really strict, so that they have an easy out clause to censor their app store, which, by the way, is probably not legal or right, but hey, we allow it, so who knows. The brand thing's the point. I remember back in the late 90s, we used to work for big enterprise companies, and they all wanted their app to look like Outlook Express. Every single one of them. Always had a side payment tree, always had a list, always had master detail in that list. And nobody does that shit anymore. And because it was dumb. And then when mobile came around, we started to build mobile apps, and we're like, oh, I really want them to look like iOS apps. Why did we want that? We didn't want that at all. It's a bad pattern. Thankfully, that's changing.
So this is probably kind of hard to answer, but do you have any application built on Phonegap that is kind of a good example of performance, great user interface, and multiple platforms. Do you have a favorite one, or one that you could point out as, okay, this is a good example of multiple platforms and speed and great one?
There's a bunch. If you go to phonegap.com/apps,
Yeah.
we try and do case studies there of things that look great, perform great, and are multi-platform. So there's 9 on the home page, but we have a whole bunch more queued up. My personal new favorite is CERN's Open Hack Days, I think it's called. I have it on my homepage here. CERN Open Days. It's on both iOS and Android. So yeah, look for CERN Open Days and try it out. It's built with something called LXJS. For some reason, they turned their transitions off on Android, which kind of bums me out because they were on. But it's got maps, transitions, multi-level views. The transitions are turned on iOS, so the transitions look great there. In Android, it just sort of reloads. What's cool about that to me, though, is it's CERN more than that it's an app. I don't know. CERN's awesome.
Yep.
So, the one that the Phonegap team generally agrees on, but I'm not sure if it has anything to do with anything, is Untapped. So they're kind of like our poster child. It's a really complicated app. It's rich. I don't know if I would call it beautiful, but I do love its utility. So Untapped is Foursquare for beer, which you can't go wrong with. And all the Phonegap team is testing on it constantly.
Oh, that's what you do. QA.
Q&A. I'm going to do some Q&A on this tonight. Yeah, this is actually a pretty great app. The Untapped has been considered very controversial. So they took the approach of designing to their brand. And they found a Windows phone on the ground or something and decided to port to it. And they shipped in the Windows Phone store now. So Untapped's like kind of leading beer app. So immediately they got tons of downloads. I think they're getting downloaded like 5,000 times a day because nobody owns Windows phones, or nobody's building for it anyways. And there's pent-up demand for apps. So just as app developers, it's a good thing to know. If you port your apps to Windows Phone, you'll get lots of users likely. But the users of Windows Phone were mad because it doesn't look like a Windows Phone app. It looks like Untapped, which is kind of like an iOS Android list thing. And people complain about it. But it's got 5 stars and 5,000 downloads a day. So the people complaining about it are probably app designers that are focused on that platform, not users. You know, people that are actually paying the bills. So it's a tricky thing.
Yeah, also thinking about Mark Zuckerberg, who told us that web apps on mobile really suck and you should never do it. And I was really surprised because they have all the money in the world and they couldn't get their apps together for a long time. But it got a lot of traction. A lot of people are like, you cannot make apps with web technology.
Well, the dirty story about that, so there's a couple dirty stories there. So that happened, and it was kind of a bummer.
You're being recorded.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. It's well known. So first of all, it's only iOS. Android, BlackBerry, Windows Phone, all still Phonegap for that. So that's still happening. And in aggregate, all of the app platforms that Facebook ships, it almost adds up to, I think, like it's a far smaller number anyways than the web is. So mobile web still trumps all the app platforms for Facebook. So the quote was kind of like out of context. Another thing to keep in mind is that was right when Apple started shipping Facebook on deck in iOS 6. So there might have been some impetus for business development reasons to have a native app, possibly. And Sencha totally debunked this whole thing anyhow, with the fast book implementation or whatever.
Because Facebook in the browser itself super fast.
Yeah.
And although there's a difference in engine, the Nitro engine versus, is that still an issue with iOS 7 as well?
Still the case, yeah. That drives us nuts. Yeah. They don't have JITting turned on. The other thing to keep in mind is these phones aren't getting worse. Every successive phone has a better CPU, more RAM, more memory. So like, yeah, it doesn't have JITting turned on. Yes, but it's not like the phone got worse or anything. Like when they do turn on, it'll be great. don't know why they haven't turned it on, but yeah. They claim security, but that's the excuse companies give when they don't want to do something.
Cripple it a little bit.
They blame security for WebGL, they blame it for just about every API. They don't
It's
want to
Microsoft with WebGL.
Yep, can't do it, it's impossible, it'll never be secure.
Not secure.
A year later,
Yeah, that's
WebGL. Yeah.
Good.
Cool. Just to let you know, I don't want to go through all the details of it, but just so that you have an example of an application built with a framework, Brian made a good point. Up to now, up to part 8 actually, there is no framework at all. I mean, there is jQuery for basic DOM manipulation, but there is no MVC framework. So you can totally do it with your own patterns and stuff like that. But just for you to have an example of the same application built with a framework, part 9 is the exact same app built with Backbone. And you will see that it's quite similar, so it's not like a big change. Backbone provides these basic objects, like, for instance, a view, and that's what you extend when you build your own custom view. They provide objects like models, and that's what you extend here when you build a model. And these objects have some basic, like as I said before, when you build a Backbone model, all you have to do is to provide the endpoint to the service, and automatically it knows how to add, update, remove, or give you lists and things like that. So it's really powerful, but at the same time, it's not opinionated at all. Just an example, not to say that this is better than Angular or Ember. It's just one example. Cool. All right, so we're in pretty good shape. We're going to move to the next topic, and this one is going to be fast because we essentially already covered it. Remember, if I look at your code and I see a lot of this in all your views, I'm probably not going to be happy, and I'm not going to give you one of these cards. Right? Because that you are really coupling your data access strategy, for instance, to your view logic, which is not a good idea. And we talked about the solution to that, which is to abstract your data access strategy with something like this. Again, this is just one possible implementation of that pattern. At the end of the day, what you're doing, you're building an abstraction layer, which is essentially an interface with a common API, and then different implementations of the same interface. Remember, the key thing is that they have to provide the exact same API, and that typically means asynchronous method invocation. OK, so remember what I told you about the fact that I spend 80% of my time in the browser when I build my app. So there is something that is really important to be able to do that, is to actually abstract data access. And I'll show you what I mean by going back to my real tablet here. And isn't that cool, actually, that I can run the exact same app? And that was actually an example of what I was just talking about. This app, I was just running it in the browser locally. So we spoke about this. All right, so here's what I'm talking about. So imagine you have somewhere in your application you need to show an alert. So I'm going to show an alert. It's an app, after all. And here we go. Now, what's wrong with this? And if you didn't know it, this is the new kind of flat version of an alert in iOS 7. So what's wrong with this? Beyond the fact that it shouldn't say hello Portland, it should say hello Lisbon, of course. But what else is wrong? Exactly. And you know what? It seems like really, really silly, but you'd be surprised how many apps I see that do just that. Yeah. Right? Because we are lazy, right? We say, hey, we need to show an alert, the JavaScript alert this, alert that. Doesn't have to be that way. you can use the, oops, okay. You can use the dialog plugin. Remember, you have to install the plugin. And instead of the simple JavaScript alert, you do this, navigator notification alert. The nice thing about that is that you can customize every single aspect of the alert dialog, and then you get something like this. I can put whatever I want in the title. I can put all the buttons that I want. Cool, right? Now, this looks like a native notification dialog. I know it looks very plain, but that's iOS 7. OK, all right. So it looks like we're going to do a global search and replace of alert and replace it by navigator.notification.alert, right? But if I do that, what happens? It stops working in the browser. So that principle number 7, I think, is about making sure that you use the best of both worlds, that when it's running on device, it looks like a native app. But at the same time, that you don't break the runnability, if that makes sense, in the browser. You want your app to run in the browser, because that's going to help you tremendously while you debug the application. So if you just use that, then you're never going to see an alert in the browser. Okay? So what do? Come on. OK. What do? You're going to have some kind of a way to abstract that. OK? So in the same way we abstracted the data access mechanism by providing a common interface with different implementation, we can do the exact same thing here. OK? What I've seen, too, is people redefining the JavaScript alert. So they test if navigator.notification exists, and then you kind of redefine the alert function, which obviously you can do in JavaScript. That's one way of doing this, in fact. OK? So make sure you do that. But it's not only about notification. It's also about storage. Make sure that, but now, I mean, for storage, typically you can use local storage, which is available in modern browsers, even on this. But if you used, for instance, on device, you use, for instance, Web SQL on iOS because IndexedDB is not available, well, make sure that either your browser supports it too, or that you have, again, an abstraction layer to store your data, which Brian wrote one. Do you still maintain that, Brian? Launcher? Sometimes?
Other people do.
Other people do.
If anybody else wants to take over that library, that'd be sweet. I have a lot of pull requests open on it. It's kind of, it's an awkward story. I don't know if you need it anymore,
Right, because in modern browsers, you pretty much have.
You're pretty good. And
yeah.
I found that people started to do bad things with it. So offline is a key capability of apps, and working offline with your data is a good thing. People started putting files and stuff in there. They're evaluating JavaScript out of there, and it's not a good pattern. So I have mixed feelings about that library.
All right. Sensors, the same thing. So make sure that, if you're using, for instance, the Compass API or geolocation, and your browser on your laptop, even though modern browsers will give you geolocation, but for some reason, make sure you test that geolocation is available and that your application doesn't stop running if for some reason it was not. And the last one is really a super important one. If I run on this thing here, I'm going to use touch to interact with the application. If I run on this, I'm not going to use touch. I'm going to use the mouse and the keyboard. And that's a very, very big one. And it's so big that it's going to be the object of its own principle. Handle touch the right way. And here is how not to do it. And sadly, I think that, I don't know, I don't want to give a number, but a large number of Phonegap applications do this wrong. So imagine, oops, for some reason, Come on, this was going to be the exciting part. My reflector thing is a little tired. Oh, here we go. OK. Enter full screen. All right. So this is your typical list in your Phonegap application. And I just told you, make sure that it works on the laptop as well. So what event are you going to use to handle a selection in the list and do something with it? When the user selects an item, and you want maybe to display the details of that item, which event are you going to use? You don't want to answer without a little gift? Is that the problem? Come on. You're going to use the click event, so let's try that. Oh, look. See what happens here? So I select, boom. It takes consistently around 300 milliseconds for the click event handler to react to me clicking that thing.
Is that across platforms?
That is mostly on iOS. And you know why iOS does that? Yeah, it wants to make sure that you really meant click, that you may, that you're not going to double click or do some kind of other gesture. After 300 milliseconds, if you don't do anything else, say, OK, he meant click. Now, when you're coming from web development, you're going to say, 300 milliseconds? Who cares? But believe me, people care. And they're going to do that, and they say, not native, next. Yeah. This is one of these little things that gives the impression of a non-native experience. So you need to fix that. How are you going to fix it? Let's use the touch event. If we use a touch event, boom, it's going to be immediate. OK, let's try. OK, see the list? Boom. Boom. See, touch start between 2 and 4, whereas click is painfully kind of dealing with the 300 millisecond delay.
We actually get bugs filed about this.
Right. So as if it was.
All the time. Yeah. Why is it slow? And it's like, sorry.
Yeah. So it looks like we just solved the problem, right? We're going to replace the click events with a touch event. Are we going to do that? Well, if you do that, what's going to happen? It's not going to work here. And now I'm going to have to do all my debugging always on device. I change a comma somewhere, need to repackage, redeploy, debug. Kind of painful workflow, right? So you want it to work in the browser. So what are you going to do? You're going to say, OK, I'm going to test if the touch events are available. Then I'm going to register a touch event. If it's not available, I'm going to register a click event instead. And you see how ugly that thing can be. So before you go do that, here we go. Before you go do that, make sure that other people didn't solve that problem before you. And this is one solution. I'm not saying that's the solution to use. I use it all the time, and it works really well for me. FastClick was developed by the guys at the Financial Times. It has been deployed not only in their mobile applications, but in many, many others. So it's a tested and proven library. What I love about it is that it's a pure drop-in library. All you have to do is to add the JS file, and you keep coding click events. And automatically, it's going to hijack your click event registration and turn them into touch event registration if touch is available. And on top of that, it's going to do the right thing, for instance, to make sure that the touch, when you select in a list, doesn't conflict with you trying to scroll. There are some kind of, edgy situations there that you need to worry about. Fast Click will solve them for you. So that, you know, if you want tonight to go home or to your hotel room and improve the performance of your application with one line of code, very dramatically, add fastclick.js in index.html, and I'm not kidding, you're going to see a big difference in how the application feels. Of course, as I said, you don't have to use FastClick, but there are other options out there. For me, FastClick has been pretty reliable and has been working consistently.
What about gestures?
Yeah, so gestures are important. So there are some libraries out there, like for instance, Hammer.js is a pretty good one that's good, because otherwise you have to kind of do it yourself, right? Handle the composite events yourself. Hammer.js has like a bunch of gestures that are defined, and so that's one that has been working for me as well.
One word of caution on those libraries: if you're going to be incorporating gestures, which is cool, do that. Just incorporate those gestures. So a bunch of these libraries exist, and gestures are complex usually and have a lot of code. So if you're only using like swipe, just include the swipe function.
Yep.
Rip it out of the library.
That's actually a really good point. Like for instance, in this presentation, this is using the swipe view from that guy Matteo, who also wrote iScroll, working really nice, super fast. You don't see it there because my streaming thing, but it's really a good library. I didn't want to add all the weight of pinch and zoom. All I needed was swipe. A really good library called SwipeView. So again, less is more, yes, in this point. And sometimes, and that's kind of related to that topic, it's not complicated. And so the next topic is about hardware acceleration. There are a ton of libraries that will give you page transitions, for instance. Hopefully, they use hardware acceleration. But sometimes people want these nice, I click something and they want transition. I've heard some people telling me that that's the reason they use jQuery Mobile, because they wanted the page transitions. Yeah. That's a bad reason to use jQuery Mobile, let me tell you, okay? I would even say that's probably a bad reason to use any library, because these days with hardware acceleration, it's just a few lines of CSS, right? You're in full control. Sometimes in these libraries, the problem is they're kind of black box. I mean, you can always look at the code, but you carry the weight of stuff. You don't really know what it's doing. So this is a typical problem, and it's so typical that I wanted to show you that it's really, really, really easy to do. You don't need jQuery Mobile to do this. So typically the way, I mean, again, there are different ways of doing it, but typically the way I do it is that I will define three classes. Right, which is going to position a page immediately to the right of the viewport, not outside the phone though, but to the right of the viewport. Left, to the left of the viewport, and center, right in the center. And when I need to move this guy there, the only thing that I'm going to do is basically change the class name. Okay, and I'm going to say, well, if it needs to move there, I'm going to assign, that's all the way to the left or center, right. So basically, you just play with that class name. Okay. So now you obviously want to see the CSS, and I'm going to show you the slow way of doing it first. The reason I'm showing this way to you first is because I still see a lot of people doing it this way. And let me just say that this is slow, at least on some devices, because it's not hardware accelerated. So it's going to be done on the CPU and not on the GPU. Okay? So basically what you're doing here, and it's going to work just fine, you're going to say, OK, see, the setup is very simple. That's why I say, don't go use a library for this. This is all it takes. Okay? Left is going to be positioned minus 100% of the viewport, so immediately outside the viewport to the left. Right is the opposite, and center, obviously, right in the middle. And you're setting a transition of 1/4 of a second here, to move to your new position, which is going to give you that animation. Now, when you change the value of an attribute like that, either with a specific pixel value or a percentage, this is not hardware accelerated. Okay? So, how to do it right? You're going to transform these values. You're going to transform the X, Y, or Z values of these attributes. So, for instance, to go to the left, you're going to do a translate 3D of minus 100%. So you transform the X attribute to this value. By using transform and translate 3D, you signal that you want hardware acceleration. This is going to be done on the GPU. So the bottom line is, don't change the value with a straight pixel value or even percentage. Always do a translate 3D of one of these values, X, Y, or Z. As simple as that. That's going to give you hardware acceleration.
I think it's a hack, though. Right?
It's considered a hack, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's a hack that's been working for 4 years now. So
Yeah.
like many hacks in the
Yeah.
web, this is becoming a practice.
Is it only if we use exactly the same code on Safari, not inside the Phonegap application? The issue is the same, or is it a limitation of the web view?
It's the same, because I actually tested even in Chrome. You can actually, in Chrome, you can display the little frame per second little dialogue, and you're going to see the difference there too.
It's exactly the same.
Yeah.
There's one other trick. I don't know, you might mention this, but so perceived performance is also a big thing. So showing a loading indicator often helps people feel like something's loading faster. We would see iOS actually has really slow animations. They're almost like insulting. They're so slow. Like takes a second to transition, but it's so damn smooth and beautiful that maybe you trick yourself into thinking it's nice. Android, however, doesn't. And it's funny, sometimes you'll see a Phonegap application, be losing frames per second, so it'll be choppy. And the way to fix that is to make it faster. And so if you're dropping frames at 1 frame per second transition, just make it a half-second transition. And guaranteed your users will be like, wow, this is fast. It is.
Yeah. All right, so I just told you not to use a library for that, which is why I wrote one.
That's so good.
It's called Page Slider, but I wouldn't consider it a library. It's like a nano library. Just an example of how to do it, but it's convenient to have it there. All right, we're almost there. On the same line, we mentioned, like for instance, for alerts, that's what I would call an HTML behavior. If you use the default JavaScript alert, your app is going to scream, I'm not a native app, right? Because it's visible, you'll see that index.html. There are a few other things here that you need to pay attention to in terms of hiding the fact that your application was built with HTML and JavaScript. Look at this. I have a list. I'm going to tap it and keep my finger on the link. Look what happens. I didn't write that code. It's the default behavior of the web view on a link. If you keep your finger on it for a couple of seconds, it's going to say, hey, do you want to open that link? Do you want to copy it? No, I don't want any of that. I want it to look like a list. Okay? So, good news. The good news is that there is a CSS attribute that you can specify for that WebKit touch callout none. And now look what I'm going to do. I can keep my finger on it for as long as I want. Nothing is going to happen. But if you're really picky, you still noticed something that you didn't like. So let me do it again. I hope we can see it on that. Yeah, we can see it. See what happens? I put my finger on it. You see that background color? I didn't code anything. That, again, is the default behavior of the web view. It's going to give you that, background kind of highlight. Okay. Again, now this is getting really into, like the small little details. But since we're talking about them, this is another CSS attribute that you can set. In fact, you're putting the color of that highlight to black, but with 0 transparency, so it's going to be completely transparent, or 0 opacity, I should say. Okay, so fully transparent. Okay, so now look, I can put my finger on it, nothing happens, and now I can be in charge of providing the highlight that I want. Or you can use this attribute to actually specify the real highlight, with a color matching your theme, that you want.
This doesn't affect any other runtime? This doesn't affect Windows or?
Yeah, Windows, like, what do you mean?
Like if you do the same thing on a Windows phone.
Oh, on a Windows phone, that's not going to do anything, obviously, because it's a WebKit.
No, I know that's
prefix.
what I'm asking, that it's
Yeah,
a WebKit.
Yeah, so to be honest with you, I don't know if you have that behavior on a Windows phone, so that's something that I would need to check. Does anybody know? I don't know. So yes, some of these are specific to iOS. So we are done with my 10 principles, but I couldn't fit them all in 10, so I came up with a number 11, which is really important, so important that in fact that 11th principle is a bunch of 10 other principles. But I felt the top 10 was a good name for this presentation. Now, seriously, this is just going to be kind of a fun way to end the workshop. I'm going to show you some code, and you're going to tell me what's wrong with it, specifically around performance. What's going to make that code slow? Now, some of this is obvious, but you'd be surprised. Look at not your code, because I know you never do that, but your colleagues. Go look at their code. So I'm going to start with something really silly and obvious, yet people do that all the time. So, come on. OK, if that doesn't work, I'm going to go back to the browser version of this. So let's go there. Da-da-da. We covered this, and now we can go there. OK. So people do this all the time. Now, this is a very trivial example, but some of them are less trivial, but basically the same problem. And sometimes it's not the, kind of the most rocket science things that make your application go faster. It's revisit your application and solve all the common sense issues. And this is obviously a common sense issue. What's the problem here?
Asynchronous loading data from somewhere to put into a controller that could be pressed before the data is loaded.
Yeah, but that's already looking very far. There is something really obvious. What am I showing here now? For people not...
Static data.
I'm showing fairly static data. When was the last time the list of states in the United States changed? I think some time ago, right? Yet you'll see that again, and again, that people load the data asynchronously and keep loading them on each view, and that's obviously criminal. So cache, cache, cache. I mean, the more you can avoid a round trip to the server, the better your application will feel. It's obvious, yet apparently people need to be reminded. What about this one that I also see all the time? So it looks like we're trying to style the back button in a header. I'm adding a click handler first. That's not styling, but I just doing something. Exactly. This is as silly as doing a SQL query 4 times when I know that I'm going to get the same results. Yet, again, look at code around you. You'll see that all the time. So what's the solution to this? Cache it. So something like this. You do the DOM query once. Whether you're using jQuery or plain JavaScript, the same principle applies. You cache it in a variable, and then you use that cached variable to do your 4 operations.
You can also combine the CSS.
Say that again?
Do CSS lines.
Oh yeah, you could. Yeah, that's a good point too. You could combine that as well. All right, this one is a little more tricky, yet that's one that I see all the time too, and that can be a lot more. That has a bigger impact because the performance impact is pretty important. So this is a view that, like we looked at before. So remember, that thing is going to be instantiated every time I want to display a product. In the initialize, I'm compiling a template, and then I use that template to merge the data and display the view. Say that again? Where is the product coming from? That's a good question. That's not exactly what I had in mind, but it's coming from somewhere. I should add it, but exactly, and that's a problem that people don't always think about. The price of compiling a template is actually pretty high, so do it once and only once. In this case, you're going to compile the template every single time you instantiate a product view, which is a lot. Remember that application, you keep looking at products, so you're recompiling the template every single time. That's bad. So here is one way of doing it, where you simply, I'm assuming you compile the template somewhere, and you pass it as an argument to the constructor, so you can render it without recompiling it all the time. There are other ways of doing it, but that would be just one way of doing it. So I'm assuming I have a view here, maybe a kind of in a contacts, you know, like your contact application, where you have a bunch of actions: call home, call office, call cell, and for each of these actions you have a nice little logo or image icon.
Is the I/O slow for loading those images?
Right. So the I/O is a problem. I mean, depending on how many you have, certainly this technique came from building games, where, you know, sometimes when you build games with animations, you think things are animated, but in fact what you're really doing, you're switching assets all the time. If you do it that way, it's never going to be fast enough. Okay? So what's the solution to this problem? When you find yourself loading way too many images, sprite. Okay? So you're going to do, and this I stole from Bootstrap actually. They have one image, okay, with basically all the icons that they use. And then with CSS, they kind of offset the background position to display really the one that you want. Okay? But in terms of I/O, that is one image to load. Okay?
Going into performance, would it be best, better or worse to use fonts for icons?
Yeah, you could use fonts as well. I didn't test. I don't know, Brian, if you know the difference in terms of performance between fonts and sprites to achieve that. Fonts are supposed to be pretty good as well for that kind of stuff.
Can't use fonts on old Android.
Okay. Can't use fonts.
Fonts are only good for more recent Androids.
What's old Android?
2.3. Yeah. Which is still about 40% market share. So
And for this, you could use fonts, I guess. But imagine, games with these are not just little logos. These are really complex. Then fonts would probably not be the right way of doing it. So depending, if it's just little, icons like that, fonts is a solution. If it's like complex images in a game, probably not. Okay. All right, this one, you need to think about it for a while. This is also, all of these are coming from real apps that either I built or that I was involved with or that we found problems with and that we improved dramatically by using these techniques. So basically, this would be like the app that we built, that we looked at today, the list of products. And then I'm going to tap a product to display the details. I'm doing my Ajax, and I know I shouldn't be using Ajax here. I should be using my data adapter, but just to keep it simple on the slide. So I'm making that Ajax call, and then I get the details of the product, and I display the view.
We do not switch to the next view?
Yes.
The data is loaded. I think we should first display the next view, then start loading the data and fill the blanks.
That is exactly right. At this point, this is all about perception, right? But there is nothing worse for a user than doing something and seeing nothing. Because at that point, you don't know if it so that's when you kind of, I'm trying to break my phone to get the 5S. So you kind of tap it, and nothing happens, okay? So the action should be immediate. People understand that it may take a while to get the data because people instinctively understand that the data has to come from somewhere. But they wouldn't understand why the view doesn't change. So the better way of doing this is something like you said. So you display the view first. It's empty, it's a template, but the data is not there yet. You display a spinner. You make the request, and when you get the data, you update the view. But at that point, when you tap it, boom, you have the transition right away as the user. Wow, okay, I know it, I got the immediate reaction to my action, and I understand that it takes a while to get the data. Totally perception. How about this one? So it looks like we are populating a list with 100 items. So I go through a loop here, and then I add an li to my list.
Just create a big string.
Create a big string. And why is that?
Because now you're touching the DOM.
I'm touching the DOM and potentially creating a redraw of the DOM every single time. That is a key. This example is a little extreme, but there are tons of actions that will trigger a redraw of the DOM. And that is extremely slow. That's when the browser or the web view has to recalculate everything, to make sure everything fits and all the percentages and all that stuff. So everything you do something to the DOM that requires a redraw, it's bad news. So you should really, really minimize the number of times the DOM is going to be re-rendered if you want. And this is a simple example for doing it. You create, as you said, a big string, and then you have one DOM operation at the end. Okay, so that's that, and that's what we had for today, except maybe one more little thing. But just to quickly summarize the principle that we covered, use single page application. Don't be religious about it, as we said, but that's your default kind of architecture. Obviously, templates, handlebars, really good, mustache, underscore. Use some kind of an MVC architecture. Frameworks, remember how to think about them. Don't use a framework if you're not sure why you use it. Sometimes I see I look at all the script and I'm like, what's that? I'm not sure. Well, if you're not sure, maybe you don't need it. Okay? Modularize, think about required JS, I think, if your application is quite big. Abstract data access for testability, your own flexibility in terms of changing the data access strategy. Device features and touch, remember, go change your app, add fast click, and your application is going to be faster. Hardware acceleration, these little hints that give away the fact that your application was built in HTML. There is no need for that. You can avoid them. And then common sense, mostly, in terms of performance. Go revisit your code. There are a lot of things, little things that you can do, and when you add them up, it ends up making a big difference. So that's what I had. I don't know if you guys have any question. I think Brian wanted to give you a quick informal kind of roadmap of where things are going. So maybe we can do that, and then if you guys have questions, we can just take all the questions you have.